There are names that history has forged into chilling symbols, into dark and scandalous legends. The name of the Marquis de Sade is one of them, having become synonymous with forbidden fantasies and the dark depths of human nature. We are accustomed to seeing him as a literary monster, a genius of vice, a figure shrouded in myth and speculation. But what if I told you that behind this notorious facade lies something more? This is not a story about a monster from a book, but about a real woman of flesh and blood, whose desperate courage nearly cost her everything, yet ultimately set in motion a machine of justice that threatened to crush one of the most untouchable aristocrats in France. We will draw back the velvet curtain of the gilded 18th century stage and peer into the soul-chilling dressing room, where, under the cover of night, true dramas unfolded, dramas that were never meant to be spoken of. This is the story of how a single encounter in a rain-swept Parisian square forever changed two destinies, etching them into the criminal chronicles of the Age of Enlightenment. On the 3rd of April, 1768, a young widow named Rose Keller was not seeking justice, but merely a piece of bread. Her tragedy might have become just another nameless entry in a police blotter had not an elegant gentleman appeared in her path, offering not alms, but a fairy tale salvation. He promised her work, money, and a warm supper, carrying her away in his carriage from poverty and despair. But when the doors of the luxurious country mansion swung shut behind her, Rose understood that she had not entered a palace, but an elaborate trap. The name of her benefactor would become eternally infamous, the Marquis de Sade. The doors of the mansion in Arcueil, upholstered in heavy velvet and adorned with bronze, closed behind Rose with a dull final thud. The sound, like a gravedigger's shovel striking frozen earth, was the first note in a sinister symphony about to unfold. The air inside was stale and thick, saturated with the scents of wax, old wood, and a faint, unsettling medicinal odor, like that of a surgeon's shop. The promised supper her imagination had painted, with hot soup, fresh bread, and perhaps a glass of cheap wine, vanished like morning mist. Instead of a welcoming dining room, she was led to a chamber where the luxury felt cold and hostile. High ceilings were lost in shadow. Tapestries on the walls depicted brutal hunting scenes, and a single candle on the mantelpiece cast flickering, predatory shadows across the Marquis's face. His soft, enveloping voice, which had so recently promised her mountains of gold, now took on metallic, commanding tones. There was no longer any sympathy, no courtesy, only an icy flame in his eyes and a crooked smirk that twisted his aristocratic features. In an instant, the mask of the benefactor was cast aside. Donatien Alphonse François de Sade, done with his performance, revealed his true face. A sharp, rough movement sent Rose's fragile figure flying against the wall. Promises were replaced by orders, and gentle words by threats that made the blood run cold. He spoke of total submission, of his absolute power here, within the walls of this house that was both his theater and his torture chamber. From a wall, where strange objects hung beside hunting trophies, he took down a long whip of many leather tails. It settled into his palm as familiarly and naturally as if it were an extension of his own arm. Any scream, any resistance, he warned, would lead to immediate and excruciating punishment. Before the girl, frozen in terror, lay a choice that was no choice at all. Either she would submit to his will and appear before him in the attire of Mother Eve, or a far more terrible fate awaited her. This was not the mere whim of a libertine. It was a calculated ritual of humiliation, a spectacle in which she was cast in the role of a silent victim. The whistle of the whip cutting through the air was the first act of this drama. Then fire seared her skin, and Rose's world narrowed to a single point of unbearable throbbing pain. The blows fell one after another, methodically, without anger or rage, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. It was as if the Marquis were studying the limits of human suffering, conducting a monstrous experiment in which Rose was merely the subject. Her body was covered in crimson welts, but even more terrifying than the physical torment was the total, crushing humiliation he inflicted upon her. He accompanied his actions with lectures on the nature of evil, the futility of virtue, and how true pleasure could only be found beyond the bounds of morality. It was torture not only for the body, but for the soul. He sought to break her will, to trample her dignity, to prove to her that she was nothing more than a thing in his hands. When the first part of the ordeal was over, he, like a solicitous doctor, offered her a jar of white wax ointment to soothe the burning. Only then, with an unperturbed expression, did he finally invite her to supper, as if nothing dreadful had occurred. The meal became a surreal nightmare. Seated at the table across from her tormentor, Rose mechanically swallowed food whose taste she could not register. She stared at his calm face, at his elegant hands that only an hour ago had savaged her flesh, and could not believe this was real. De Sade, however, was in excellent spirits. He discoursed on philosophy, literature, and the harm of social norms, which, in his view, only shackled man's true nature. He tried to draw her into this perverse dialogue, to convince her he was right, to make her an unwilling accomplice to his worldview. For him, this was a continuation of the experiment. Having broken the body, he now sought to invade her mind, to infect it with the poison of his ideas. After finishing the supper and his philosophical ramblings, the Marquis de Sade led the exhausted captive to a small room on the second floor and locked the door. The room was nearly bare, just a hard bed, a chair, and a tiny window near the ceiling, more like an arrow slit. He left her alone to process the pain, the humiliation, and the terrible lecture on the uselessness of good. Night fell upon Arcueil, but for Rose it brought neither peace nor oblivion. In the icy darkness of the small room, where the only light was a sliver of moonshine, her mind worked with feverish clarity. The horror did not paralyze her. On the contrary, it ignited in her a desperate will to live. She knew that if she remained here until morning, she might never be free again. This man would not let her go. He would continue his monstrous games until he had utterly destroyed her. And so, in that tiny prison, a plan of escape was born, daring, almost impossible. Her gaze fell upon the coarse linen sheets on the bed. It was her only chance. With trembling, wounded hands, she began tearing them into long strips, her fingers fumbling as she tied them into a makeshift rope. Every knot was an act of defiance, every inch of fabric a step toward salvation. She worked in complete silence, listening for every creak in the house, terrified that her tormentor would return. The window was barely wide enough to squeeze through. She had to shed most of her clothes, which snagged and hindered her Adrenaline dulled the pain in her lacerated back as she, pulling herself up on the chair, began to push her body through the narrow opening. The cold night air stung her skin, but it was the air of freedom. Securing the makeshift rope to the leg of the bed, she began her descent down the sheer wall. Her hands slipped, the knots dug into her palms, and at any moment she risked falling to the stones below. But the thought of what awaited her above in that room was more terrifying than any height. Finally touching the ground, she did not allow herself a second's delay. Barefoot, in nothing but her undergarments, she broke into a run, fleeing that accursed house without a glance back. She ran through the thorny bushes of the park, through the dark, unfamiliar lanes of the Arcueil suburb, constantly looking over her shoulder in fear that the nightmarish Marquis was chasing her with his whip. Every rustle sounded like the footsteps of pursuit, every shadow his silhouette. Despair was about to consume her when she heard the creak of wheels and the snorting of horses ahead. A peasant's cart emerged from the darkness. It was a miracle, a salvation sent from heaven itself. Choking on sobs, Rose threw herself in its path, pleading with the driver for help. The sight of a half-naked, disheveled, and weeping woman appearing from the dead of night could have frightened anyone, but fortunately for her, the cart's owner was a kind man. He helped her into the wagon, covered her with his outer coat, and after listening to her broken, terrified story, asked no further questions and whipped the horses. He promised to take her to the first police station in Paris. The entire way, Rose never stopped crying and looking back, begging him to drive faster. It felt as if the devil himself were hot on their heels, but the cart plodded steadily onward, carrying her from a realm of darkness and pain back to the world of men, a world where law still existed and where there was a glimmer of hope for justice. That night in Arcueil was over, but Rose Keller's battle had only just begun. When the cart, its wheels groaning, stopped before the stone edifice of the police commissariat, Paris was just beginning to stir. The first rays of the April sun timidly pierced the morning fog, painting the gray facades in pale watercolor hues. For Rose, this dawn was a symbol of new hope, a fragile promise that the nightmare was behind her, locked away within the walls of that damned house in Arcueil. However, the world she had returned to was one of indifference and rigid rules. The station door opened, and she was enveloped by the heavy stench of cheap tobacco, sour wine, and unwashed bodies, the eternal scent of the Parisian underbelly. Inside, in the dim light of tallow candles, sat two guards, their faces masks of weariness and ingrained cynicism. Over long years of service, they had seen it all: drunken brawls, complaints from cuckolded husbands, the tears of streetwalkers, and they had learned to greet any human drama with impenetrable calm. The appearance of a half-clothed, trembling woman with wild eyes on their threshold elicited nothing more than lazy curiosity. To them, she was just another story from the night, one that would likely come to nothing. But this was no longer the frightened beggar who had stood on the Place des Victoires just hours before. The horror she had endured had not broken her, but forged her, crafting steel-like resolve from her despair. Her voice faltered at first, her words tangled in sobs, but she forced herself to speak. She told them of the well-dressed gentleman, his false promises, the carriage ride, and the grand house that had turned out to be a trap. The guards listened with half an ear, exchanging knowing smirks. The story was as old as time. An aristocrat, a foolish girl, some rough play, a trivial matter unworthy of their attention. But at a certain point, the tone of her narrative shifted. Rose began to describe not seduction, but methodical, cold torment. She spoke of the whip, of death threats, of a lecture on the futility of virtue. And then, seeing they did not believe her, she did something that required every last ounce of her courage. She turned her back to them and let the coarse peasant cloak the driver had given her slip from her shoulders. In the dim candlelight, a horrific sight was revealed to them. Her pale skin was crisscrossed with crimson-blue welts, like parchment, upon which some unknown torturer had scrawled his monstrous script. In that moment, something in the stale air of the commissariat changed. The cynical smirks vanished from the guards' faces, replaced by expressions of astonishment and professional interest. These were not the marks of a tumultuous night. This was undeniable proof of a brutal crime. One of them silently poured her a cup of hot herbal tea in a chipped mug. The other went to wake a sleepy clerk. The story was no longer trivial. And when Rose, having composed herself slightly, named her tormentor, Donatien Alphonse François de Sade, a tense silence fell over the room. The name was familiar to them. It belonged to the highest aristocracy, to the circle of those who considered themselves above the law. But it was also shrouded in ill repute, surrounded by a trail of scandalous rumors and dark tales that had, until now, remained mere whispers in the salons of high society. Now, those whispers had living, brutalized proof. The case was escalating from a common affair to a scandal of national proportions. The slow, inexorable machine of justice began to turn. The clerk, dipping his quill into an inkwell, began to scratch across the paper, meticulously recording every word of the victim. Rose Keller was no longer a victim. She was now a plaintiff. That same morning, a detachment of guards was dispatched to Arcueil. Their arrival at the gates of the luxurious mansion was like an intrusion of coarse prose into an elegant poetry salon. The Marquis de Sade himself greeted them without the slightest surprise or fear. He was dressed in an expensive house robe, calm, polite, and full of aristocratic dignity. When informed of the reason for their visit, his face showed only a hint of mild bewilderment mixed with contempt. He firmly and categorically denied all accusations. His version of events was coherent, logical, and the complete opposite of Rose's account. Yes, he had met a young woman in the square. Yes, he had brought her to his home. But everything that followed, he claimed, was an entirely voluntary act, a game she had eagerly consented to. He painted her as a licentious girl seeking thrills, or worse, a cunning blackmailer who had decided to make some easy money. He spoke with confidence and conviction, looking the guards directly in the eye. In his world, a world of permissiveness and privilege, the word of an aristocrat carried infinitely more weight than the tears of a common beggar. This time, however, his high station was not an impenetrable shield. The complaint had been officially filed, the evidence documented. Before the law, flawed and biased as it was, stood two competing narratives. On one side, a slandered but living woman with proof etched on her body. On the other, an influential aristocrat with flawless logic and a complete lack of witnesses to his innocence. The Marquis was ordered to accompany the guards to Paris. For him, this moment was a genuine shock. That he, a descendant of an ancient line, could be subjected to such a humiliation. His protests, his appeals to his status, were ignored. The power of the law, which he so despised in his philosophical essays, had caught up with him in reality. As he was led to the carriage, he likely cursed the foolish baker's widow, the corrupt magistrates, and this entire imperfect world that had dared to infringe upon his freedom. But the wheels were already in motion. The case of Rose Keller versus the Marquis de Sade was officially open, and Paris, ever hungry for a scandal, held its breath, awaiting a sensational trial that promised to be the most talked-about event of the season. The walls of the police station became the first arena for the battle that unfolded between a destitute widow and one of the kingdom's most scandalous aristocrats. Here, in a cramped and stuffy office, their testimonies clashed like two swords. On one side was Rose. Her weapons were her tears, the sincere terror in her eyes, and the gruesome marks on her back, which served as silent but eloquent witnesses to her truth. She repeated her story again and again, without faltering or changing a single detail, her voice ringing with indignation as she heard the brazen lies of her tormentor. She was not merely complaining, she was demanding retribution, the harshest possible punishment for the man who had trampled her dignity and nearly taken her life. On the other side was de Sade, cold, arrogant, and in perfect command of himself. His weapons were his words, honed in philosophical debates and an innate sense of superiority. He did not defend himself, but attacked, accusing Rose of slander, of avarice, of attempting to profit from his good name. He painted her as a skilled schemer who had provoked him into certain actions and was now feigning tragedy to extort money from him. His logic was flawless, his arguments persuasive. He was an actor playing the part of an innocent victim of blackmail, and he did so with brilliance. However, into this duel of words and emotions, a third decisive player emerged: money. The justice system of the 18th century was not only blind, but also intensely pragmatic. Often, the outcome of a case was decided not on the scales of Themis, but on those of a money changer. Rose, perhaps on the advice of a shrewd legal clerk or by her own intuition, left her opponent a loophole, a tiny path to salvation. She made it known that her violated honor had a specific price. That price was named and recorded in the official report: 2,400 livres. For an ordinary Parisian, this was a colossal, almost fantastical sum, a fortune that would take long years of honest labor to accumulate. For an aristocrat of de Sade's standing, it was also a considerable amount, but by no means insurmountable. Paying this compensation could have transformed a criminal offense into a regrettable misunderstanding, closing the case before it went to trial and saving the Marquise's reputation from utter ruin. It was a cynical but common method for resolving delicate problems in that era. It seemed a solution had been found, and the scandal was about to die down, dissolving in the clinking of gold coins. But here, the Marquis was in for another unpleasant surprise. For all his aristocratic splendor, his estates and his titles, Donatien Alphonse François de Sade was broke. His passion for a lavish lifestyle, expensive pleasures, and risky ventures had long since drained his coffers. He simply did not have that much cash on hand. He did not refuse to pay, understanding it was his only chance, but he asked for a delay. This financial impotence became a fatal humiliation and a strategic blunder. The delay gave his enemies time and allowed the judicial machine to gain momentum. While he frantically searched for the funds, the case began to accumulate new, far more sinister details. In the archives of the judiciary, someone very opportunely unearthed an old, almost forgotten case dated October 1763. 5 years earlier, similar accusations had been leveled against the Marquis. A dressmaker named Jean Testard had complained that de Sade had lured her to his house, where he had subjected her to a brutal whipping and forced her to shout blasphemies. The story was nearly identical, as if written from the same script. The emergence of this old case in the investigation files was a catastrophe for de Sade. What could have been dismissed as an isolated incident, a strange whim, or an unfortunate misunderstanding now looked like a pattern, the established signature of a predator. The prosecutors rubbed their hands in glee. One case was a scandal, but two was a relapse. The prosecution had gained a powerful trump card. The Marquis's defense, built on the premise that Rose Keller was a unique adventuress, was collapsing before their eyes. Could Jean Testard have been the same 5 years prior? The probability of such a coincidence was virtually zero. Back in 1763, de Sade had managed to extricate himself with minimal losses. A few months of not too burdensome confinement in a castle and a fine. His influential family and high status had done their work, but now the stakes were immeasurably higher. Public opinion was inflamed, and rumors of the divine Marquis's exploits were spreading throughout Paris. A second accusation of a similar crime threatened him not with mere imprisonment, but with the scaffold. The air now smelled of the gallows. At this critical moment, as the clouds gathered over Donatien's head, his family stepped onto the stage. More accurately, his wife's family, the powerful and influential de Montreuil clan. The Marquis's father and mother-in-law, though they despised their profligate son-in-law, could not allow a stain of such disgrace to tarnish their family name. And beside him stood his wife, Renée Pélagie de Montreuil, a woman of tragic destiny whose blind, selfless devotion to her husband knew no bounds. It was she who became his guardian angel and his chief defender. The de Montreuil family, using all their connections and financial resources, threw themselves into rescuing their hapless relative. In a very short time, they raised the required sum of 2,400 livres and paid it to Rose Keller. It seemed that the danger had passed and the case would be closed. But it was too late. The scandal had grown to such proportions that simply buying their way out was no longer an option. The judicial system, sensing the scent of blood and public outrage, was not about to back down. The money was accepted, but it could not halt the flywheel of justice that was already spinning. On April 12, 1768, de Sade was formally charged with attempted murder and assault. The enormous compensation had not helped. The Marquis was taken into custody and sent to the Château de Saumur to await trial. The Château de Saumur, towering over the picturesque banks of the Loire, was never a prison in the conventional sense. It was a place of honorable isolation, a kind of aristocratic quarantine for those members of high society whose actions became too scandalous for the salons of Paris, but whose status made it unthinkable to throw them into a common cell with thieves and vagrants. It was to this gilded cage that the Marquis de Sade was delivered, and at first his confinement more closely resembled a country holiday at the state's expense than a harsh punishment for a serious crime. The illusion of justice was maintained. He was deprived of his freedom of movement. But that, in essence, was where the restrictions ended. The Marquis wore no shackles and ate no prison gruel. On the contrary, he lived in spacious apartments, dined at the same table as the castle's commandant, and engaged him in long conversations about politics and literature as if he were a guest, not a prisoner. He was permitted to stroll through manicured parks, breathe the fresh air, and enjoy the scenery. Moreover, he was not even deprived of his social life. Visitors, friends, and relatives came to see him without hindrance, bringing the latest Parisian news and gossip. This parody of justice reached its zenith when it was revealed that even in matters of the heart, the Marquis faced no constraints. Rumors, later confirmed by documents, suggested that within the castle walls he continued to lead his accustomed lifestyle, finding opportunities for romantic encounters with ladies. For Donatien, this was a confirmation of his special status. He was certain that the system, created by aristocrats for aristocrats, would never dare to truly punish him. It might wag a finger at him, temporarily isolate him from society, but in the end, it would always recognize his right to privilege. He viewed his stay in Saumur as an annoying but temporary inconvenience that would soon be resolved through the efforts of his influential in-laws. He wrote letters, worked on his manuscripts, and thought with contempt of that foolish little widow who had dared to challenge him, not understanding the rules of the game. He was confident he would soon return to Paris and all would be forgotten like a bad dream. However, he had underestimated the public outcry his case had provoked. The story of Rose Keller had become the talk of the town, discussed in marketplaces and coffee houses, and providing fodder for countless pamphlets and satirical verses. The judicial officials, sensing that the entire city was watching the proceedings, could not afford to let the matter slide. And when word reached Paris of the comfortable, almost resort-like conditions in which the man accused of such a heinous crime was being held, the cup of patience overflowed. This was no longer mere leniency. It was an outright mockery of the law. The court issued an emergency decree to transfer the Marquis de Sade to a place where he would fully experience what true imprisonment meant. On April 30th, without much notice or preparation, a convoy arrived for Donatien. To his absolute shock and horror, he was informed that he was being immediately dispatched to the fortress of Pierre-Encise in Lyon. The illusion shattered in an instant. Pierre-Encise was the polar opposite of Saumur. It was a grim, ancient citadel, damp and cold, with thick stone walls that had absorbed the pain and despair of its inmates for centuries. There were no parks for strolling or dinners with the commandant here. There were tiny cells, meager food, and coarse jailers who cared nothing for titles or ranks. For de Sade, accustomed to comfort and luxury, the transfer to Pierre-Encise was a profound shock. For the first time in his life, he confronted the harsh realities of prison life. The aristocratic bubble in which he had lived his entire life had burst. Here, he was not a marquis, but simply prisoner number so-and-so. Yet, even in this harsh fortress, he spent no more than a month. The judicial machine continued its work, and soon a new order arrived to bring the accused to Paris for interrogation. His new temporary home became one of France's most infamous prisons, the Conciergerie. The name alone struck superstitious terror into the hearts of Parisians. It was within the walls of the Conciergerie in June of 1768 that the key interrogation of the Marquise took place. It was conducted by Jacques de Chavannes, a respected and incorruptible magistrate, a man who could not be swayed by pity or deceit. This was no longer a polite chat with an amiable commandant, but a rigorous, methodical questioning. Chavannes laid out the facts, the evidence, and the witness testimonies before him, demanding clear and concise answers. But de Sade, though physically worn, had no intention of surrendering morally. Looking the investigator directly in the eye, he repeated his previous version with unshakable confidence. Yes, Rose Keller had been in his house. Yes, certain activities had occurred between them. But all of it, he maintained, had been entirely of her own free will and even at her own insistence. There was not a shadow of remorse or doubt in his words. He continued to play his part, the role of an innocent victim of a cunning schemer, clinging to the only line of defense he had. He still believed that his word, the word of the Marquis de Sade, would outweigh the testimony of some street beggar. But times were changing, and the old privileges were beginning to crack. A trial awaited him. The August sun of 1768 beat down mercilessly on the rooftops of Paris, turning the narrow streets into scorching stone corridors. In the stuffy courtroom, where the air was heavy with the smell of sweat, dusty papers, and unspoken tension, one of the season's most sensational dramas was drawing to a close. The case of Rose Keller versus the Marquis de Sade had reached its climax. All arguments had been made, all testimony heard. Now it was up to the judges. Society held its breath, awaiting the verdict. Many hoped for a harsh, exemplary punishment that would prove that not even the noblest aristocrat was above the law. Others, conversely, were sure that the powerful de Montreuil family would find a way to extract their wayward relative from any trouble. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere in between. The sentence, read in the monotonous voice of the court clerk, was a masterpiece of legal compromise. It was severe enough to appease public opinion, yet lenient enough not to utterly destroy the life of a member of the high nobility. Donatien Alphonse François de Sade was found guilty, but not of attempted murder as the prosecution had demanded, but of the lesser crimes of assault and licentious behavior. The court took into account the fact that he had already paid the victim a huge sum in compensation, which was interpreted as a form of admission of guilt and an attempt to atone for it. In addition, he was ordered to pay a fine of 100 louis d'or to the state treasury, a significant but not ruinous amount. As for his prison sentence, the judges displayed a remarkable feat of arithmetic. He was sentenced to serve another 5 months in the very same grim fortress of Pierre-Encise that had so terrified him. This term was likely calculated so that, considering the time he had already spent in custody, his release would be in the near future. Justice had been served, but its scales, as always, had tipped slightly in favor of the powerful. For the Marquis, this was an undeniable victory. He had escaped the scaffold, escaped a life sentence. He had gotten away with just a few months of discomfort and a financial penalty. De Sade served his time within the walls of the Lion Fortress and was released. But this harsh lesson that fate had taught him nothing. The affair with Rose Keller did not become a turning point for him, did not compel him to reconsider his views or his actions. On the contrary, it seemed to strengthen his conviction in his own righteousness and his contempt for public morality and law. Upon leaving prison, he plunged back into the abyss of his dark passions with even greater zeal. The rest of his life was an endless series of scandals, flights from justice, new victims, and new prison terms. He would commit many more villainies, be cursed by his contemporaries, declared insane, and spent a total of 11 long years in various confinements, including the famous Bastille and the asylum at Charenton. His name would become a symbol of vice, and his writings, penned in prison cells, would shock and mesmerize future generations. He would forever remain in history as the divine Marquis, a genius and a villain, a philosopher and a tormentor, a figure who continues to provoke fierce debate to this day. And what of Rose? What became of the poor baker's widow who one evening had the misfortune of crossing paths with the most famous libertine in France? Against all expectations, her story did not end in tragedy. She was not broken by the nightmare she had endured. Having received what was for her an immense compensation, she managed the money with astonishing intelligence and prudence. She did not squander it or fall prey to new swindlers. This money became the foundation for a new, prosperous life. She left Paris for good, as if wishing to erase all traces of the past from her memory. Soon after, she remarried, and this union proved to be remarkably successful and happy. Madame Keller, as she was now known, transformed into a respectable bourgeoise, a good wife, and an excellent homemaker. She proved that even after the most terrible ordeal, one can find the strength to rise again and build a life of happiness. The rest of her life was quiet, peaceful, and entirely private. She did everything in her power to erase that terrible April day from her memory. The name of the Marquis de Sade never again passed her lips. She flatly refused to speak of him or what had happened at the house in Arcueil, even with those closest to her. Her husband, her friends, that page of her life was torn out, burned, and scattered to the wind. She did not want to be a perpetual victim. She did not want her name to be associated with that of her tormentor. She chose life, not the shadow of the past. And in this silent, stubborn act of forgetting lay her ultimate victory. While the Marquis de Sade remained a slave to his passions until the end of his days, turning his life into an endless scandal, Rose Keller found the wisdom and strength to simply move on. Hers is not a tale of a weak victim, but a hymn to the resilience and unbreakable will of an ordinary woman who came face to face with absolute evil and refused to let it destroy her.